Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming this evening. We'd like to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Hartford Behind the Scenes, How the Connecticut Legislative Session Works. And we're so glad that you could join us to learn more about how legislation gets written, revised, and voted into law in Connecticut. Also, we'll be talking tonight about a little bit about what's happening on the ground right now, and perhaps most importantly, what you can do to get involved. My name is Kathy Sepiel, and I'm a member of Save the Sound's communications team, and I'll be your host this evening. And I'd like to introduce to you our panelists for this evening. First of all, we have State Representative Joseph P. Gresco, who represents the town of Stratford, where he was born and raised. He is co-chair of the Environment Committee, which handles matters including conservation, recreation, pollution control, fisheries and game, state parks and forests, water resources, flood and erosion control, and all matters relating to the Department of Agriculture. We also have with us this evening State Representative Jonathan Steinberg, who is currently serving his 7th term representing most of the town of Westport. He is co-chair of the Energy and Technology Committee, which handles all matters relating to the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and energy planning and activities. We also have with us Chris Smith, who is managing partner of the government relation and lobbying firm Rome Smith and Lutz. He served for 5 years in the administration of Governor Daniel P. Malloy, including as Director of Policy and Government Affairs. And finally, on our panel this evening, we have Charles Rothenberger, who is the in-house climate energy attorney for Save the Sound. With 2 decades of experience working on environmental, energy, and land issues, he is well-versed in lobbying before the Connecticut General Assembly, as well as state agencies and municipal boards and commissions. So I welcome all of our panelists this evening. And before we actually get started talking with them, I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to fill out one quick poll question about your previous experience interacting with your state legislators on proposed legislation. So that might include sending them emails, making phone calls, anything you've done to reach out directly to your state legislators specifically. So if you haven't done so already, you can click on the poll icon at the bottom of your screen, and or actually it's probably popped up for you already. So while we're doing that, I'll also note that we have about 50 people signed up for the webinar this evening, just so you don't feel like you're here by yourself in this webinar format. And we will be ending with a Q&A for our panelists. So if you think of questions that you would like us to ask them, please drop those in the Q&A. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Please pop them in there at any time, and we'll get to them hopefully in the last 10 minutes or so. So it looks like we have quite a few experienced lobbyists here, advocates here. About 73% of you say that you have contacted your state legislator about an issue or a bill before. And we're going to ask you again at the end to tell us how you're feeling about your level of confidence in participating in the legislative session at that point. So let's jump in first to a quick overview of how the legislative process works in Connecticut. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Charles Rothenberger, to lead us through some slides. Charles?
Well, maybe I will begin by saying that I am delighted to be here and glad that we are anticipating a return to normalcy somewhat this session. As everyone is likely aware, the last several years, because of the pandemic, we've been operating in first a completely virtual world in 2021 after pulling the plug early in March and the 2020 session. And then last year, 2022, we were in a hybrid situation, sort of taking some baby steps to return to in-person hearings, in-person meetings, and in-person lobbying. So while the COVID numbers don't look all that promising as it stands now, we began the session with the Capitol and the Legislative Office building fully open to the public, and I know there's been some encouragement for business to take place in person as much as possible. So with that sort of context, I see the slides here, so we'll jump in. So the timing of the legislative session is set by the Connecticut State Constitution, although the mechanics of the session are determined by the legislature through rules that they pass on the first day. The odd numbered years are long sessions, and the even numbered years are short sessions, and they run respectively from the first Wednesday after the first Monday in January to the first Wednesday after the first Monday in June, or that same strange timing running from February to May in a short session. So the session did begin last Wednesday. As we see here, both legislators and committees in the long session can submit proposed legislation. It goes by several different names. Proposed bills are those that are submitted by individual legislators and typically are a brief summary of what that bill intends to accomplish. It's not necessarily drafted in formal statutory language. Committees can choose or vote to adopt a proposed bill as a committee bill, voting to have it drafted in formal legislative language, or they can, on their own initiative, raise fully drafted bills which have not previously been introduced as individual proposed bills. In this slide, so every bill gets a number and is assigned either to the House or Senate for the purposes of following it through the legislative process. Connecticut is a little bit different than the legislative process that you might be familiar with in Congress in Washington, D.C., where they have to have reconciliation of bills between the House and the Senate. Here in Connecticut, even though bills are House or Senate bills, as they move through the committee process, all of our committees are joint committees. So they are comprised of both House members and senators who serve as the leadership and rank and file on those committees. And maybe the next slide, actually, am I advancing the slides here? Kathy, maybe if you could advance the slides, that would be great. So each bill also has a committee of cognizance depending upon what the subject matter of that bill is. Committees can choose to do several things with the bills. They can choose to have a public hearing on a proposed bill, sort of the general concept, get thoughts and ideas about that general concept, or obviously schedule public hearings on fully drafted bills as well. Sometimes the bills get bounced around a little bit. If a particular committee is sent a bill for consideration, it may determine that the subject matter is really within the province of a different committee. So rather than taking any action directly on that bill, it can send it along or refer it to that other committee. Next. So public hearings. These are really the meat of the legislative process. And as I mentioned, can happen on different types of bills. They may be more or less fully fleshed out. This is really the opportunity for the public to have a formal role in the process. Obviously, you can be talking to your legislators and other legislators, committee members throughout the course of the legislative process. But the public hearing is your opportunity to get your perspective, your experience, and your position on the record. And there are a few tips if you are choosing to engage in a public hearing before a committee. First of all, your opportunity to testify orally is rather limited. Typically, you have 3 minutes to present your case. That goes by extremely quickly. But you can also submit written testimony, and that's encouraged as well. And your written testimony can be any length whatsoever. So you needn't feel that you have to get all of your thoughts down in 3 minutes. Committee members do read your testimony prior to the public hearing, so they should be familiar with it. Typically, hearings are noticed at least 5 days before they occur, so you'll know what's coming up and what bills you want to submit your testimony on. There is a process to do that electronically on the Connecticut General Assembly website. And one of the real advantages of testifying in person, whether that's virtually or actually being present in the committee room, is that it gives you an opportunity to answer questions from the legislators. Although your formal testimony is limited to 3 minutes, legislators at the conclusion of your testimony can and frequently do ask questions, and that can go on for quite some time, depending upon the subject. So it gives you an opportunity to expand on and illuminate your testimony and really provide the testimony that's on the legislators' minds. I will also say, although everybody loves to testify early, if you have an opportunity to linger a bit in the committee room, if your testimony is scheduled for later in the process, that provides you with a really great opportunity. Frequently, questions that are asked of an earlier participant, they may not have the answer, and you may have it, so you can share that with the committee members. Or they may have provided an answer that you disagree with, so you have an opportunity to provide somewhat of a rebuttal to that testimony. And I think that underscores a really important point about how you approach your testimony. I think a lot of times there is a tendency to want to read a formal prepared statement, and that's perfectly valid. Although I would suggest that you probably do not need to read your actual testimony, as that's something that the legislators already have in front of them. But rather, if you're comfortable enough, use your 3 minutes of testimony to address perhaps things that have already occurred in the hearing room. As I mentioned, expanding on earlier questions or addressing subjects that may have come up that perhaps were not going to be the direct subject of your testimony at all, but you have some particular insight and could be quite valuable. So I guess that's, be flexible in your approach to testifying. And I think you'll find that provides the greatest value to the process. I think the next slide. Yes. So following the public hearing, committees can take several actions. They can choose to take no action whatsoever on the bill, in which case it dies through inaction. They can choose to pass it out of the committee, either as originally proposed or with certain changes to the bill. And if they vote on it with changes, that's called a substitute bill, a substitute for the original proposal. So that's one way in which a bill will evolve based upon the testimony presented at the public hearing. They can also pass it out and refer it to another committee. Again, if the subject matter of the bill falls within the purview of more than one committee, it can go to a different committee. And following favorable action on the bill, it then gets sent to the nonpartisan committees at the General Assembly. The Office of Fiscal Analysis will prepare a fiscal analysis for the bill, basically indicating what impact that might have on the finances of the state or municipalities. And the Legislative Commissioner's Office will prepare a plain language summary of the bill, which will travel with the bill as well. So rather than trying to parse out what subsection A sub 1 comma D means, there will be a plain language explanation of the bill, which can be more readily understood. I think, okay, I think we've covered this in the Office of Fiscal Analysis, how much the bill will cost to implement. I think we covered that with the Legislative Commissioner's Office and the translation. So I mentioned that the committees are staff, or the members of the committee comprise both senators and members of the House. However, bills are labeled either Senate bills or House bills. So once it's been voted on by the Committee of Cognizance and has been translated and the fiscal analysis has been done, it will go either to the floor of the House or the Senate, depending upon the bill. And each chamber does need to vote individually on the bill, but it is the same bill that each chamber considers. So if it's a House bill, the House will take it up first, pass it. Then it will go to the Senate, they will take it up, pass it, and vice versa. That being said, the House and the Senate can also change bills through the amendment process. So if the House passes the bill as presented to it, it goes to the Senate then changes something with an amendment, it then gets sent back to the House for reconsideration with that new language. So at the end of the day, both the House and the Senate are voting on the exact same language. Next slide. So both chambers vote to approve the bill. Next slide. And then, of course, it goes to the governor for his consideration. At the point at which both the Senate and the House have passed identical language, the bill is then considered a public act. It's assigned a public act number, and the governor has several options available to him or her. They can either sign it, they can send it to the Secretary of State with objections, essentially a veto, or they can take no action whatsoever. And in Connecticut, if the governor takes no action on a bill that's been duly passed by both chambers, it passes automatically. And that time period depends on whether the legislature is in session or not. If the legislature is in session, the governor has 5 days to sign it or veto it, or if with no action, it will pass. When the legislature is out of session, the governor has 15 days. And then next slide, I believe. If the governor vetoes it, both the Senate and the House can override that veto with 2/3 votes, 2/3 majority votes. And then the bill becomes a law. And typically in Connecticut, most laws either have October effective dates or January effective dates. So just because it has become a law in June or July, there will be several months before the provisions of that actually take effect. And I believe that is the conclusion of those slides. So thank you for bearing with me through that.
Thanks, Charles. And now we want to turn to our panelists and talk a little bit about how this all plays out in terms of what the different people involved in the legislative session are actually doing on a day-to-day basis and the roles that they play. And so I think we'll start with the most obvious people, who are the legislators themselves. So Representative Steinberg, maybe I could start with you by asking, and let's back up a little bit. What are you doing to prepare for the legislative session even before the session begins?
That's a great question. I think it differs significantly depending upon what the legislators' roles are. In most cases, virtually every legislator, except for the newbies, as we call them, the first termers, have some sort of role, whether it's a political role as a deputy majority leader or deputy speaker, or as chair or vice chair of one of the 20-odd committees. The chairs, as you might imagine, have a lot of work to do. Obviously, in the long session where anyone can introduce a bill, there are a lot of ideas out there, but most chairs are not waiting to see the portfolio of introduced bills. They already are thinking about those things that they want to prioritize early in the session. One of the most important tools that we have as legislators is something called screening. Screening is when typically you have the chairs and the ranking members, the minority party, and maybe the vice chairs and maybe some subject experts in the room. And you go through bills one at a time to determine whether or not you want to move them forward, whether you need more information, whether they're easily melded into another similar bill, trying to get your arms around the issues that have been raised by various legislators and factor them into your limited number of public hearing dates such that you can figure out what it is you really want to tackle. And, you know, honestly, in any given session, there are some good ideas that just don't get the time of day because our dance cards are full. I am going from being chair of the Public Health Committee, which is an A committee. For those who are not familiar, the distinction of A committees are somewhat larger and meet on Monday, Wednesdays, and sometimes Fridays, whereas B committees meet Tuesday, Thursdays. So I went from a committee that was an A committee and would have public hearings on as many as 60 bills, which is a little bit over the top, frankly, to a B committee with energy and technology, which will be encountering far fewer bills and have fewer public hearings and the like. So you would think that that would make the task measurably simpler. But one of the other wrinkles of A versus B committees are your committee deadlines. We have to a certain point in which to pass bills out of committee, we call that J-ethic. There's a little bit of Latin involved, and I won't go into that. But the idea is bills cannot reach the floor of either chamber for a vote unless they've been passed out of committee favorably, meaning that you get a majority vote in that sense. So I have to get used, for example, to having weeks fewer in which to square away all the bills by the deadline. For rank and file members, depending on what their other roles are, it's not as intense in advance in session. If they're been around for a little bit, they're probably renewing acquaintances and relationships such that they can talk to those who they put their trust, whether they're advocates, lobbyists, experts in the field, to find out what's on their minds, which could shape the priorities for a particular committee. And the other challenge is we're all on more than one committee. The Senate, they're on a bunch of committees. In fact, definitely chair one and definitely vice chair another. So you got to make sure you're on top of what's going on in all 3 or 4 of your committees such that you can manage the flow. And one thing I'll mention, and I'll stop talking and give Representative Greshko a chance, is that there's a rhythm to the session. Charles alluded to this. There's the committee process, which happens right after we start introducing bills, and we have screening and we winnow down bills. We have public hearings, we vote them out of committee. Then there's a bit of a lull, not long, before we start meeting more regularly as a full assembly body, the House and the Senate. And that pace kind of picks up as we approach the deadline. I guess we're all typical of human nature. You think we get a lot of bills done earlier in the session? Not so much. We leave way too many of them to the end. There's a big race to the finish to try to get them done before our final day, which is called sine die. And it's almost as if there are 2 different sessions. There's the committee session and then the floor session. And obviously you have to go through one to get to the other. But there is this sort of rhythm where things kind of pick up speed on committees and then end, and then pick up speed on the floor side before they end. So it's a little idiosyncratic. Other states do it slightly differently. Connecticut, for example, does not carry over bills from one year to the next. Every year is a clean slate. Other states do that differently. So it's always time to make the donuts for us. And now that I see that Joe's on the phone, now's a perfect time to hand it off to him. No, I can just keep talking if need be.
We can ask, we'll give Representative Gresco a chance to get off the phone. We'll ask Chris Smith, what is it that you're doing leading up to the session? How are you getting prepared for the legislative session? And maybe you could talk even more basically about what your job is, first of all.
Yeah, absolutely. So unlike Representative Steinberg, who is a chairman of a committee, and unlike Representative Gresco, who's also chairman of a committee, I'm not in the legislature at all. As a lobbyist, I advise a number of clients, including Save the Sound, who my firm has proudly represented for a few decades now. We prepare in different ways. I think Representative Steinberg did mention that leading up to a session, there's oftentimes engagement with constituents and experts in the field and lobbyists. We certainly do a lot of that. And I think this year is a particularly interesting one for off-session activity for lobbyists like myself, because it was a state election. The non-presidential elections mean that there's a lot of changes going on in Connecticut. All of the legislative seats were up for re-election, governor's office, and all of the constitutional officers like, Department of, Attorney General, Comptroller, Secretary of State, all of those are brand new folks, not brand new folks, but they're re-elected. But oftentimes during open seats or folks are defeated, there's new places, new faces and new places. And that was certainly the case this year. We have 3 new constitutional officers. We have a fairly large freshman class in the General Assembly. And when you combine that with the freshman class from last time, who are second termers, they didn't really get the full experience of the legislative session during COVID because so much was shut down. So a lot of our work is really, networking, reestablishing some of those relationships, communicating with chairmen like Representative Steinberg and Representative Gresco on things that we'd like to see during the session. That's a lot of what we do leading up to it. We spend as lobbyists every day in the Capitol, and our job is to make sure that we're the eyes and ears and the rapid response, team members for organizations like Save the Sound. And the way that we do that effectively is to be there and to be able to communicate directly with legislators. Representative Steinberg and Joe Gresco are certainly on my speed dial very regularly, sometimes maybe a little bit too much, but they're great advocates for us, and we work with them closely, as well as many of their colleagues in the House and the Senate.
So Representative Gresco, maybe I could ask you a slightly different question, which is to kind of walk us through a typical day for you during the legislative session. What are you actually doing day to day? Maybe you could kind of give us a feel for what that's like.
Well, I woke up and no, I mean, let me say, I have to have another job. Between the legislature and my other job, I can make ends meet, but we don't get into this doing this for the money. So it depends on if I have to go into the office or I'm going to the Capitol. And I like to plan my own schedule, so I know where I'm going and what I need to have when I get there. So to kind of dovetail on what Jonathan has said, I am either having meetings with advocates or lobbyists if I choose to go to Hartford, or reading proposed bill ideas. Some of the numbers are starting to get posted on the system, so I'll go and screen through those and see if ironically, a lot of them have been environment bills so far, which, I'm not happy about. But see about resurrecting bills that we couldn't get over the finish line last year that are priorities for either myself or my Senate co-chair. Avoiding people whose ideas I do not want to entertain, but I will entertain some of them, because you always have to have a bill or two that you can use for horse trading, both between chambers and between parties. And that's basically, how the day would work for now. We are having our first screening meeting at the end of this week, so we will decide what bills we're going to advance forward as concept bills that will hopefully get a little bit of drafting language on them before we decide to have them go, well, when they go to a public hearing. So I don't know if you've in the past had the idea of testifying on a bill and you go to read the bill and it's 2 lines. So I'm not a big fan of that. I'm not a big fan of fleshing out the whole thing either, but I'm interested in getting a little bit of meat on the bones so that people have an idea of what they're testifying in behalf of or against going forward. So that'll be the next couple of weeks for me, and then trying to finalize realistically how many bills I think that environment can get over the finish line. We've been having a good run the last few years in that we have been able to put a lot of good legislation over the finish line, and I credit leadership for that, because in many years past, we will do a lot of work, and then at the very end, the bill wouldn't get called. So, which frustrates me to no end. So I'm a big proponent of contacting and getting the litmus test with leadership to see if we do all this work, and then is it going to get called? Because if it's not, then I'm not doing it. So that's pretty much what a day would look like for me over the next.
Great, thank you. And Charles, we haven't heard from you yet, but maybe you could give our audience an idea of what is happening on Save the Sounds part, kind of on a daily basis during the legislative session.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned at the top, it's been a little bit different the last couple of years because of so much being shifted to the virtual world and Zoom meetings. But while I typically can't find the time to be up there every day, a lot of it is certainly being up there for committee meetings, being up there for scheduled meetings with individual legislators, whether those are committee chairs, rank and file, caucus leadership, as well as, just generally trying to be a presence in the building. One of the things about lobbying is that it's really tough to be successful if you're not in the building. I think Chris alluded to that. Sometimes the most important conversations that you have are the ones that happen that you weren't anticipating, simply because you run into somebody up at the Capitol and you get to talking, or you're there and available for a legislator if they have a question. And that frequently happens. Representative Steinberg alluded to the fact that a lot of the work of actually passing bills through the chambers, the House or the Senate, is kind of backloaded. They tend to linger on the calendar as behind the scenes negotiations are happening between legislators, between advocates and legislators, to try to shape the contours of a bill before it's called on the floor of the Senate, drafting amendments that will help accomplish that. And frequently, as the bill changes and amendments are filed, legislators will have questions, and they can certainly text a question or pick up the phone and call, but it's really convenient if you're there in the building outside the House or the Senate for them to just walk outside and sort of ask you that question and get that information. So all of that is sort of part of the day-to-day, and it's a little bit chaotic and a little bit random sometimes, but hopefully all of the planning and forethought that you put into it leading up to the session pays off as you're running around like chickens in the last days of the session.
Great. So Representative Gresco, let me ask you, we're going to share Save the Sound's top priorities for this session in a moment, but would you like to talk at all about any particular hopes you have or issues you're really interested in addressing in this session?
Unfortunately, due to collateral damage at the end of last session, my horseshoe crab bill, the horseshoe crab bill, didn't make it over the finish line. So that will be a priority for this year. And then the tweak in that is going to be that since I had to wait an extra year, we are going to not allow for the medical harvesting of the horseshoe crabs on the Connecticut side of the Sound. Since there isn't any going on now that I'm aware of, I've asked. I want to close the door before it opens, kind of thing. And the new regulations went into effect last July. So the industry has experienced a little bit of a ratcheting back of the harvesting already. I just want to close to stop the harvesting of them, period, and let them come back in honor, for lack of a better term, in honor of I don't know if everyone has heard, but Professor Mattei, who was the person that ran Project Limulus for 20 years here in the state, unfortunately passed away during the course of the end of last year. So I want to get this over the finish line for her. The tire industry has asked for additional time to come back with a stewardship model for used tires, similar to the way that we were able to pass what hopefully was going to soon be implemented, a stewardship and an EPR for cylinders, which will start in the state. The tire industry has asked to give them the time to come back and present to the legislature what they think they can do to alleviate the number of discarded tires in every municipality across the state. So I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say, but that's a priority for myself. Some of the items that didn't make it last year as well include environmental justice. We are going to be revisiting rodenticides, neonics, a whole slew of potential phasing out of polystyrene, straws, stirrers. So it's going to be a busy year. Do I think we're going to get everything accomplished? No, but you fight and we'll give it a go on some of the other ones that I'm probably forgetting at this point, but I'm sure there will be quite a few environment bills.
Great, thank you. And Representative Steinberg, what about you? A couple of priorities you have in mind this session?
Well, I think the public will drive our priorities this session. As we speak, people are receiving their monthly energy bills, and will soon be very focused on the cost of providing energy here in the state of Connecticut, and for good reason. People have a right to be frustrated. We've long been a high cost of energy state, and that has only been brought home by the recent significant increase proposal by the utilities, which we can thank good old Vlad Putin for jacking up the natural gas prices, which are actually starting to come down a little bit. One of our challenges as a committee will be to educate, which seems like an endless task on energy and technology, if we can get people to pay attention in the first place. This year, they'll be paying attention. But we need to explain to people, ever since we deregulated, by that which we mean we decoupled the utilities from the responsibility for generating, owning the generation function, and actually forbade them from doing so in most cases. We have had a kind of a hybrid system, which for the most part has worked kind of okay for us, though we remain a very high cost of energy state. But the risks that we built into that, the inherent risks of volatility, really have become manifest in their most extreme during this next 6-month period, but would maybe something that actually is sustained for several years. We need to explain to people how we got to where we are, what we've been able to do, which is relatively little, to mitigate some of the worst effects of these large rate increases, and what the scenarios are, what the paths are we can take to the future. We will have to explain to people, including our good friends in the environmental community, that we are in a transition, but we are nowhere near the point in which we can count on renewable energy to replace out fossil fuels. And that date may be a good number of years away. That every extra kilowatt hour of energy we can obtain, we will need just to meet the increased needs for electricity as we have more electric vehicles, more houses converted to all electric systems, maybe getting rid of their oil tanks in favor of heat pumps. Demand for electricity is going to grow significantly. So people have to get used to the idea that there are no easy, quick solutions for them. They're not going to like to hear it. They're not going to like the fact that there may not be immediate legislation that we can pass that's going to make it all go away. But that's our responsibility, is to initiate the dialogue and to start getting every idea on the table so we can make good choices for the state. Do we want to really totally throw the entire regulatory environment into a cocked hat, the revolution versus evolution comparison? Or do we want to make some modest changes that might allow the utilities to be more nimble in their procurement of energy, such that we do not have the problems that we face today? And then there's the separate issue, which is also related to the moment. If this is a moment in terms of people being hot and bothered about their energy prices, this is also a moment in terms of the once in a multi-generational opportunity of federal dollars on the table for infrastructure. And I would submit we could spend every last federal dollar of infrastructure money 5 times over, and it wouldn't meet all the needs that Connecticut has as a state. We are a perfect storm deteriorating infrastructure state, whether it's our roads and bridges, whether it's our electric grid, whether it's our housing, whether it's our water and wastewater treatment systems. We have a lot of needs, and thank goodness there are federal dollars on the table, but we're going to need to be very strategic in how we prioritize spending that money. Some of that money is just allocated to the states on a percentage basis, but a lot of that money is competitive. You have to bid for it. You have to put in proposals. And with the state government, the executive branch already down a ton of people because of the retirement cliff last year. We lost a lot of experience. It's going to be a real struggle for them to even apply for a lot of these federal dollars. But I submit that we must grab every dollar we can, make sure we have dollars to match it, because there are simply so many needs. And I was alluding to earlier the fact it's not just about generation. People haven't noticed it yet, but their delivery charges on their electric bill have been going up even more regularly. We have a huge need not only to upgrade the grid so that it is able to exchange electrons 2 ways when we have solar panels and EVs and charging stations at home and smart appliances. It will also need to expand regionally. A lot of our issues are not Connecticut specific, so that we have a robust transmission network that allows us to bring in offshore wind or grid scale solar in such a fashion that it can come into the grid and we can all benefit from it. These are complicated subjects that we need to talk about, but they may not lead directly to significant legislation during this session. We may end up having a number of study bills with the goal of trying to come up with answers in time for next session. That's not going to make people particularly happy, but it's a more prudent, deliberate path to coming up with good answers. The last thing we want to do is to have some sort of emotional, reactive, knee-jerk, legislation that makes matters worse over the long haul. So, we will have our usual litany of energy bills. We have to look at the energy mix. How do we encourage offshore wind, which is also an economic engine potentially for the state of Connecticut? What's the role of storage? What's the role of hydrogen? How do we get Hydro-Quebec energy down here? There are a lot of things for us to talk about, but it's very hard to, in this case, handicap the session in terms of figuring out what's going to be the primary legislation. And I don't want to forget, we also have responsibility for broadband as part of energy and technology. And whereas there are federal dollars on the table, which hopefully will allow us to address concerns about access in rural areas and even in inner cities where there people aren't necessarily aware or have the connections they need to have a robust internet. This is an opportunity for us to sort of flesh out that entire network and make sure that everybody has this, well advertised 1 gig speed to use for all their internet devices. So we'll have a number of informational forums this month that will help people understand both the energy generation and transmission pieces, as well as one on broadband. And that, I think, will help level set the key points that people need to be common understanding, so we can have an intelligent conversation about what comes next for Connecticut. So that wasn't very legislative language specific, other than to say that everything's on the table and we need to have a conversation that will probably last beyond this session.
That's actually a great segue. Thank you. Into the next thing we want to share, which is you alluded to needing to help educate people about a lot of these issues. And so I'm going to ask my colleague, Alex Rodriguez, who is Save the Sound's environmental justice specialist and a grassroots organizer, to share a few concrete actions that you in the audience can take, having to do partly with educating yourself about the issues. I'm not going to share the slide, but some of you have probably already seen Save the Sound's own legislative priorities in an email that we sent to supporters. So we're just going to drop in the chat for you. If you haven't seen that, you can take a look at the priorities that we've laid out in each of our program areas and our hopes for this legislative session ourselves. So Alex, you want to talk a little bit about what people in the audience here tonight can do to participate themselves in the legislative session?
Yes, I want to first start by expressing my appreciation to this panel for walking through the behind the scenes processes of the legislature. I've been community organizing for 7 years now, and having this type of introduction would have been so helpful for me at the beginning when I was advocating for clean water and affordable water rates. But regardless, sorry about that. But regardless, walking through these steps regarding community engagement with the legislature has been tasked my way tonight, and I'm glad to run through it. So, one way you can take action in Connecticut for legislative action is joining an advocacy group affiliated with the cause that you are taking on. At Save the Sound, we have several different legislative priorities, from climate to clean water to lands, and defense of environmental rules that we welcome people's engagement on. I personally lead a program at Save the Sound for where I engage individuals under 30 in the legislative process called the Youth Eco Advocacy Corps. And I'll drop my email in the chat in a little while so that folks can email me directly on that. And so joining an advocacy group affiliated with your issue is one way. Joining Save the Sound and filling out our action alerts is another way to get engaged regarding the legislative process. My colleagues and I, we send many action alerts to engage our audience so that folks have simple testimonies in front of them where they can say, hello, Representative Bresco, I would like horseshoe crabs well protected along the sound, or Representative Steinberg, I would like energy efficiency programs well protected. Writing those sample messages is very impactful, but we encourage people to relay their personal stories regarding these issues, how you're being impacted and how your neighbors are being impacted by particular causes. And we encourage folks to email info@savethesound.org to join our mailing list if you're not already, and you will receive action alerts over the course of this legislative session to engage on these issues. Another way that I just mentioned is keeping in touch with your elected officials. Something very handy about getting a hold of legislators is it is usually their first name dot last name at cga.ct.gov, where you can email your legislators about particular causes. In the subject line, put in environmental justice or put in horseshoe crabs, energy rates, etc. It's especially helpful when you tell them the bill number so that they can know how to act on an issue and where you're coming from. Signing up for your legislators email list is very important. On the Connecticut General Assembly website, you're able to look up who is your legislator based on your street and zip code and town, of course. And so that's a helpful way for you to be able to identify them. Go to their legislative websites. They post updates, not only legislative, but sometimes they'll share things regarding social programs that folks should know about, such as the Energize Connecticut program, and thanking them for what they do to support the cause. Meeting them halfway on the issues is very important. You can track where the bills you care about on the bulletin. It's also very helpful for you to select the committee that you think your bill resides in. For example, there are many bills that you would select the Environment Committee tab on the Connecticut General Assembly website versus there may be some bills that are an energy and technology bill or a transportation bill or a public health bill. Keeping tabs on the bulletin and really the main page is very important to figure out when committees are meeting, and taking a look at their agendas for the day to see if they're discussing your issue is also very important. And the next point I'd like to make is mass mobilization. It's very impactful to email your legislator about a particular cause, or even phone their office and leave a message behind with their legislative aides. But definitely do not underestimate the importance of a rally in front of the Capitol or a rally in your town with people most impacted by a particular cause. I will say personally, there are many community organizations that are a lot more impactful in communicating or inciting peaceful protests than I am able to organize. And so having a fine balance of legislative engagement versus mass mobilization, participating in rallies and and Capitol Lobby Days is a good balance to maintain. And sharing your passion with your family and friends, turning out in numbers when the time to testify comes around is very impactful. Legislators notice this when you have a big crew of people wearing similar T-shirts to you, saying "Save the Planet" or "Climate Action Now" and so forth. You will certainly be well received in the Environment Committee and the Energy and Technology Committee. And I think that wraps up my portion. So thank you all for joining. I'll hand it back over to Kathy.
Great. Thanks so much for those suggestions, Alex. And I'm going to just turn back to Chris Smith for a moment. He has a ton of lobbying experience, and I wonder if there's anything else you want to add to Alex's advice about how people can get involved in the legislative session.
I think he did a great job. I would add a couple of things. The first is, just make sure that you're doing your homework before you communicate. And when you make contact, I think it's very important. If you're a constituent, identify yourself as one. I think that me as a contract lobbyist, I reach out to a number of legislators with whom I have relationships, and they may be very fond of me. But if I'm not a constituent, constituents have greater impact. So if you are one, make sure you identify yourself as one. The other thing I would just add is two things. One is, if you don't know the answer to something, one of the worst things you can do is wing it, because I think you want to establish relationships with legislators who are going to rely on you, who are not experts necessarily in what you might be. If they ask a question you don't know the answer to, don't feel compelled to pretend that you know the answer, because if that's not helpful. And if you give legislators information that's incorrect, that negatively reflects on them potentially, and you certainly don't want to do that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know the answer to that question, or I'm going to need to follow up with some more information for you because I don't want to give you the wrong answer. I think I probably said that to Representative Steinberg a dozen times in the last several years. And quite frankly, I think he appreciates that more than me trying to wing it. And then lastly, I would say that after you make contact, follow up is always good. These legislators are dealing with a lot of stuff and a lot of different areas. And don't be shocked that your priority might not necessarily be theirs. But following up does kind of help imprint those things that are important to you into their arenas, and I think that's certainly appropriate. But I think Alex did a great job. Those are the things I would add.
Great, thank you so much. So we just are pushing up against 7 o'clock here. We have another quick follow-up poll for you all, asking how confident you feel now about lobbying for your issues this legislative session. So we'll see if we can pop that poll up. And then while you're working on that, we're also going to move into our Q&A session. So if you need to go, we've run up against 7 o'clock here. By all means, thank you for coming. And I hope that some of you can stick around because we have a few, I'm told we have a few great questions to share here with our panelists. And I want to thank Representative Gresco. Had to jump off on a town council matter, so he's not going to be here to be included in the Q&A portion, but we really appreciate his time, and I hope that Representative Steinberg and Chris Smith and Charles Rothenberger can stick around for a few more minutes anyway. And so we have a question here. How nonpartisan are the nonpartisan offices or committees? And Charles, I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, my experience has been that they are extremely nonpartisan. They really serve the committees and the legislature as a whole. Specific staff members from the Legislative Commissioner's Office that's responsible for providing guidance and interpretation, as well as drafting legislation, and the Office of Fiscal Analysis, which we mentioned does the sort of the fiscal impact of bills, are really there to serve the committee, to provide information, to help the committee chairs with their responsibilities if questions arise. So yes, all of the caucuses, the House Democratic, Senate Democratic, House Republican, Senate Republican, do have their own partisan staff as well, which engage more in the sort of the policy making details, but the nonpartisan offices, and I'd throw the Office of Legislative Research in there as well, which is the office that fields formal legislator inquiries on particular issues, really are not engaged in policymaking. They're engaged in serving the needs of the legislature and the committees.
Great, thank you. We also have a question. So I'm going to give this to Chris Smith. Is it possible for citizens to engage with the Office of Fiscal Analysis on the costs of a bill? Do lobbyists engage with that office? Chris?
Good question. Speaking for myself, I tend to not do that because it really, I think, undermines the nonpartisan nature of how they operate. There are times where I do engage with the Office of Fiscal Analysis, but whenever I do, I always do it with the blessing of the chairman or the committee leadership. In fact, lobbyists are not allowed in the Office of Fiscal Analysis or the Legislative Commissioner's office on the 5th floor of the LOB. So I think a lot of times Fiscal Analysis will do their own outreach. There might be times where they might proactively reach out to me if I have a client that might have information about certain cost things, but proactively, it's typically frowned upon to try to lobby those offices because they really do try to maintain their nonpartisan and unbiased stature, I suppose.
Thank you. So it looks from our poll results like about 41% of you are totally ready to go. 47% of you are feeling like you can do it with a little bit of support, and 12% of you aren't quite ready yet. And so that's where Save the Sound steps in, because one of the things we love to do is to educate our supporters about these issues and about how to go about advocating for the things that are important to you. So it looks like we don't have any more questions for now, although those were terrific questions. Thank you. And
I will just say, I'm sorry. I think a couple of the questions were answered in writing, and I'm not sure if all of the attendees can see the answers. So a couple of them, I think, just bear repeating or highlighting for folks who are on the call.
Great, thank you.
A great question was, when does a bill need to be introduced in order to be considered for public hearing and the rest? And those deadlines vary depending upon the session. This year, in a long session, and depending upon the type of bill it is, those deadlines vary from this Friday, if it's an individual proposed bill, sort of that very broad, general concept language that we heard for consideration, to February 15th, for a bill that a committee is voting on its own cognizance to raise, which is not related to any proposal before it. General rule of thumb is if you're interested in getting legislation before the General Assembly, getting it into the hopper earlier rather than better is a good idea, and having those conversations with legislators earlier rather than later, because again, going to the human nature, just as the legislature tends to put its work off till the end, I think as those deadlines come closer, they start getting more and more requests and more rapid requests. So talking to them earlier sets your issue apart, and legislators can give it a little bit more time and consideration, perhaps. Someone was interested in a list of legislative deadlines that will be posted on the Connecticut General Assembly website in the next couple of days. It is not there yet. But if you go to the website and you go to session items, a pull down menu, and under committee, you go to deadlines, at some point, hopefully before the end of the week, that will bring you to a spreadsheet with all of the legislative deadlines for introducing bills, having public hearings, voting them out of committee, etc.
Great. Thanks for sharing those, Charles. Appreciate it. We're going to let you go at 7:07. On behalf of Save the Sound, I hope that even those of you who are still feeling maybe a little bit tentative will find a way to dip your toe into the water this session and get involved in some small way. Thank you in advance to all of you for your participation, whether it's large or small, because none of the work we do is possible without you. And of course, I would also like to thank our panelists again for joining us today, Representative Joseph Gresco, Representative Jonathan Steinberg, Chris Smith of Rome Smith and Lutz, Charles Rothenberger of Save the Sound, and also our colleague Alex Rodriguez of Save the Sound for his presentation. We really appreciate all of you taking the time out of your workday to share some of your knowledge and experiences and insights with us. And again, if you'd like to sign up for Save the Sound's emails and be looped in on advocacy opportunities this session, please email us at info@savethesound.org. And maybe we can pop that in the chat one more time for folks. Thanks for joining us. And I hope everybody has a great evening.